You're looking at the bottom of a sea. There's no drought. There's no accident. It's simply vanishing. This is the Caspian Sea, the largest lake on Earth. And I'm standing 30 miles from where the shore should be. 6 feet in 18 years. And scientists say this is just the beginning of the collapse. 15 million people depend on it. And 5 governments are pretending nothing is happening. We've seen this story before. It was called the Aral Sea. And no one believed it until it was too late.
There is a body of water larger than Japan dying before our eyes, and the entire world remains silent. We pride ourselves on monitoring glacier melt by satellite, but we ignore an entire sea that is shrinking 20 times faster than the oceans are rising. We spend billions building ports that will be dry before our children retire. We finance oil fields in waters so shallow that support vessels can no longer reach the platforms. And while the rest of the world debates rising sea levels, the largest inland body of water on the planet is doing exactly the opposite. It's disappearing. In this documentary, we will reveal the catastrophe that 5 governments are trying to hide. From a caviar industry that lost 90% of its fish in 2 decades, to prehistoric seals that no longer have ice to birth their pups. From the largest environmental disaster of the 20th century that already happened in the neighboring region, to the question no one wants to answer, will the Caspian Sea be next? January 2025, port of Aktau, east coast of Kazakhstan. A cargo ship with a 12,000 ton capacity waits at the dock. But when loading begins, the engineers stop at 8,000 tons. They cannot add a single kilogram more. The captain looks at the waterline painted on the hull, and then at the bottom he can almost see. If they load more, the ship runs aground before leaving the port. This is not a logistics problem. It's a symptom of something much bigger. Between 2006 and 2024, the level of the Caspian Sea dropped more than 2 meters. To understand the scale, this means that the coastline in the northeast has receded up to 50 kilometers. Cities that were ports are now tens of kilometers from the water. Ships that once sailed freely now crawl through hastily dredged channels, carrying only 75% of their capacity. And you know what the most disturbing part is. The Caspian Sea is falling at a rate of 7 centimeters per year. That's 20 times faster than the world's oceans are rising. While Pacific islands fear being swallowed by the sea, 5 countries around the Caspian face the opposite problem. The sea is fleeing from them. The current level has already hit the historical record of 29 meters below the global ocean level. And scientists predict this is just the beginning. By the end of this century, the Caspian Sea could drop another 9 to 18 meters. A third of its surface will simply evaporate. An area larger than all of Belgium will emerge from the bottom as a desert of salt and toxic mud. But why does no one talk about this? The answer involves oil, geopolitics, and a collective amnesia about the largest environmental disaster that already happened in this same region. But before we get there, we need to understand where the water of the Caspian Sea comes from. Because when you discover who controls this faucet, the story becomes much darker. Moscow, 1930s. Soviet engineers unrolled giant maps on wooden tables. The plan is audacious. Transform the Volga River, the largest river in Europe, into a staircase of energy. Dozens of dams, reservoirs the size of countries, hydroelectric plants that would illuminate the empire. The Volga rises in the hills northwest of Moscow and winds for 500 kilometers until it empties into the northern Caspian Sea. Alone, it provides 86% of all the fresh water that enters the Caspian. Without the Volga, the Caspian Sea would be a salty lake rapidly shrinking toward extinction. The Soviets knew this. But progress doesn't wait. Between the 1930s and 1980s, the Soviet Union built more than 40 dams on the Volga and its tributaries. The Rybinsk Reservoir, completed in 1941, covered 750 square kilometers. The Samara Reservoir, finished in 1957, swallowed 300 square kilometers of land. They were artificial seas created in the middle of the continent. The price? The Volga's flow plummeted from 400 cubic kilometers per year in the 1920s to something between 210 and 232 cubic kilometers today. Almost half the water that should reach the Caspian Sea now evaporates from the reservoirs, irrigates wheat plantations, or spins turbines in power plants. And here comes the part no one mentions at climate conferences. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, Western sanctions have cut European and American agricultural imports. Moscow responded by drastically expanding wheat cultivation in the lands around the Volga. More wheat means more irrigation. More irrigation means less water reaching the Caspian. The war in Ukraine is drying up a sea thousands of kilometers from the front. Kazakh experts are already pressuring Russia to release more water from the dams. Moscow's response? Diplomatic silence. The Caspian's faucet is in the hands of a country that has other priorities, and while negotiations drag on, the sea continues shrinking. But blaming only the dams would oversimplify a complex tragedy. Because there is an invisible killer working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's accelerating faster than any model predicted. Imagine a giant pot on the stove. Water enters from one side, boils and evaporates from the other. If you turn up the heat, the water disappears faster than it can be replenished. That's exactly what's happening to the Caspian Sea. The region around the Caspian is warming 3 times faster than the global average. While the planet warms 19 degrees Celsius per decade, the Caspian warms 51 degrees. Warmer air sucks more humidity from the surface. More intense sun accelerates evaporation. And unlike the oceans, which receive water from rivers around the world, the Caspian depends on a handful of sources that are all diminishing. A 2020 study published in the journal Nature calculated the numbers. If carbon emissions continue at the current rate, the Caspian Sea will lose between 9 and 18 meters of depth by 2100. 9 meters means 23% of the area lost. 18 meters means 34%. We're talking about 112 square kilometers emerging from the bottom. An area larger than Iceland becoming desert. And you know what happens when the bottom of an industrial sea emerges. Dust storms carrying oil residues, heavy metals and toxic salt. The same storms that already sweep through cities around the former Aral Sea, causing epidemics of respiratory diseases. The exposed bed of the Caspian won't just be new land. It will be poison in powder form, waiting for the first strong wind. But the most frightening thing isn't the future. It's that we already have an example of what happens when you ignore the signs. On the east coast of the Caspian, connected by a strait only a few meters wide, there is a lagoon called Kara-Bogas Gol. At 18 square kilometers, it functioned as a natural drain for the Caspian. Water flowed in and evaporated, leaving behind mountains of mineral salt that the Soviet industry exploited. In 1980, Soviet engineers panicked. The Caspian's level was falling, and they blamed the lagoon. The brilliant solution? Build a dam blocking the strait. Cut off Kara-Bogas Gol from the Caspian like closing a dripping faucet. The result was instant and catastrophic. In 4 years, the lagoon dried up completely. 18 square kilometers of water became a salt basin. Toxic dust storms began sweeping across Turkmenistan, poisoning crops and sickening populations hundreds of kilometers away. The ecosystem collapsed. The salt industry closed because there was no more water to crystallize new deposits. And you know what happened to the Caspian's level? It kept falling. Because the problem was never the lagoon. It was the climate, it was the dams, it was agriculture. The dam was destroyed in 1992, and Kara-Bogas Gol took years to recover. But the lesson wasn't learned, because while the lagoon was drying up, something much worse was happening a few hundred kilometers to the east, and that disaster was not reversed. To this day, it serves as a warning of what's to come. But before we get to the ghost that haunts this entire region, we need to talk about who is dying first. Because the Caspian Sea isn't just water. It's home to creatures that don't exist anywhere else on the planet. And they're disappearing faster than we can count. Winter 2023, northern Caspian Sea, where there should be a plain of solid ice. Scientists find only fragments, plates too thin, too small, too unstable. And somewhere on this melting ice, the last Caspian seals desperately try to give birth. The Caspian seal is the only marine mammal of this enclosed sea. It evolved here over millions of years, completely isolated from its Arctic cousins. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 5 million of them. They swam in schools so dense that Soviet hunters killed tens of thousands per year without even needing to aim. Today, fewer than 70 Lausarund remain, a drop of more than 90% in a century. And here's the problem. These seals can only reproduce on ice. Unlike other species that can give birth on beaches or rocks, the Caspian seal needs floating ice plates to give birth, nurse their pups, and mate. It's an adaptation of millions of years that has now become a death sentence. In the last 20 years, the ice area in the northern Caspian has decreased by 40%. Projections show that a drop of just 5 meters in sea level would reduce the breeding habitat by 81%. There wouldn't be enough ice left for most females to give birth. In a few generations, the species would enter an extinction spiral. And the seals aren't alone. Have you ever eaten caviar, or at least seen those tiny tins that cost more than a minimum wage? Caviar comes from sturgeon, a prehistoric fish that has been swimming on Earth for more than 200 million years. It survived the extinction of the dinosaurs, but it's not surviving us. The Caspian Sea is home to 6 species of sturgeon, including the beluga, whose caviar can cost $20,000 per kilogram. The beluga is a giant that lives up to 100 years and only begins to reproduce after age 15. These long cycles mean that any impact on the population takes decades to recover. In 2008, all commercial sturgeon species in the Caspian were classified as critically endangered. Some may already be functionally extinct, existing only in captivity. Predatory fishing, pollution, and dams blocking their spawning routes have created a perfect storm. But the falling sea level added the final blow. Sturgeon need to swim up rivers to spawn. When the level drops, the deltas become too shallow. The fish can't reach the breeding sites. It's as if someone had erected an invisible wall between them and the next generation. And while the seals fight for ice and the sturgeon for deep water, there is a cruel irony happening in the depths of the Caspian. Because down there, under just a few meters of increasingly shallow water, is buried one of the largest oil treasures discovered in recent decades, and it's becoming inaccessible. Kashagan Field, Northern Caspian Sea, 2013. After 13 years of construction and more than $50 billion invested, the consortium of oil giants finally opens the valves. It's the largest oil field discovered in 40 years, with estimated reserves of 13 billion barrels. Shell, ExxonMobil, Total, Eni, all bet their chips here. A month later, everything stops. Technicians detect plumes of gas escaping from underground pipes. The gas at Kashagan contains 17% hydrogen sulfide, a poison so lethal that a few breaths can kill. The pipes, corroded by acid, were cracking. The field that was supposed to be Kazakhstan's future became a multi-billion-dollar nightmare. But that's not even Kashagan's biggest problem. The field is located in waters ranging from 2 to 10 meters deep. In winter, temperatures of -40 degrees freeze the surface for 5 months. In summer, heat of +40 degrees turns the sea into a cauldron of evaporation. It's one of the most hostile environments on the planet for extracting oil. And now the water is disappearing. Support vessels that once sailed freely now run aground, trying to reach the artificial drilling islands. The consortium has been forced to dredge ever deeper channels just to maintain basic operations. Every centimeter the level drops increases costs and risks. The question no one wants to ask: what happens when you invest $50 billion in infrastructure that might end up on dry land? And Kashagan isn't alone. The ports of Aktau and Kurik, Kazakhstan's main maritime outlets, are already in emergency mode. In 2024, the Belgian company Jan de Nul was hastily contracted to dredge Kurik port, increasing the depth to 7 meters. In 2025, Aktau began the same process. These are operations costing hundreds of millions of dollars just to keep the ports functioning. But dredging is a temporary solution to a permanent problem. If the projections are correct, if the level drops another 10 meters by the end of the century, the coastline in the northeastern Caspian could recede up to 89 kilometers. The ports being renovated today will be tens of kilometers from the water. Billions of dollars in infrastructure will become stranded assets in the middle of the desert. And while governments and corporations try to plug ever larger holes, there is a shadow that hangs over this entire region. A memory that everyone tries to forget, but that reappears every time someone looks at the Caspian's numbers. Because what is happening has happened before, and it ended much worse than anyone imagined. Muynak, Uzbekistan, 1960. Fishermen drag overflowing nets to the busy pier. Cargo boats wait to transport the catch to markets throughout the Soviet Union. The port teems with life. The Aral Sea, the fourth largest lake in the world, sustains a fishing industry of thousands of workers. Muynak, Uzbekistan, 2024. A tourist walks through a cemetery of rusted ships. The hulls rot in the sand, tens of kilometers from where the water used to be. There are no fishermen, there are no fish, there is no sea. Just a toxic desert called the Aralkum, where dust storms carry salt and pesticides to cities hundreds of kilometers away. The Aral Sea lost 90% of its area in a single human generation. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union decided that the Central Asian steppes would produce cotton, a lot of cotton, the white gold that would supply the empire's textile factories. To do this, they diverted the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, which fed the Aral, to irrigate plantations in the desert. The plan worked. Uzbekistan became one of the world's largest cotton exporters. The price was an entire sea. In the beginning, Soviet authorities had data. Hydrologists documented the falling level. Models predicted the collapse. Reports circulated through Moscow's ministries. But production targets were more important than scientific warnings. Cotton continued to be planted. Water continued to be diverted. The sea continued to dry up. When the Aral finally split into smaller lakes in the 1990s, salinity had increased tenfold. All commercial fish died. 40 Azazaran to 60 Azadar fishermen lost their jobs. The industry that sustained the region evaporated along with the water. But the worst came later. The exposed bed of the Aral was contaminated with decades of pesticides and chemical fertilizers that ran off from cotton plantations. When the wind blew, dust storms carried this poison across the continent. Rates of cancer, respiratory diseases, and anemia skyrocketed in surrounding communities. Babies were born with deformities. Life expectancy plummeted. In 2011, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visited Muynak and called the disappearance of the Aral one of the worst environmental disasters on the planet. And now, looking at the numbers for the Caspian Sea, scientists ask the inevitable question: are we repeating history? The similarities are disturbing. A large, enclosed body of water, rivers diverted and dammed, economic interests that ignore scientific warnings, multiple countries that can't cooperate, and a falling level that accelerates faster than models predicted. There are differences too. The Caspian is much larger, much deeper in the south, and its decline is partially climatic, not just caused by water diversions. But the final result could be frighteningly similar. The shallow north of the Caspian, where Kazakhstan's ports, oil fields, and seal breeding areas are located, could virtually disappear by 2050 if the current trend continues. The coastline could recede so much that maps will need to be redrawn. Coastal communities will face the choice between migrating or withering away. And while the Aral had decades of denial before anyone admitted the problem, the Caspian has something the Aral didn't have: a clear warning of what's to come. The question is whether anyone will listen. The 5 countries around the Caspian, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Iran, have signed treaties, created commissions, held summits. In 2026, there will be a special session on the Caspian crisis in Astana, but treaties don't create water. Commissions don't reverse climate change. Summits don't convince Russia to release more water from the Volga in the middle of a war. The truth is that saving the Caspian Sea would require something we rarely see in human history: 5 nations with divergent interests cooperating against an invisible long-term enemy. It would require Russia sacrificing agricultural production, Kazakhstan rethinking investments in oil, Iran and Turkmenistan coordinating water policies, all reducing carbon emissions that warm the region. Until that happens, the largest inland body of water in the world continues shrinking. 7 centimeters per year, 2 meters per decade. Meter by meter, the Caspian is becoming the new Aral. We began by asking why no one talks about this. The answer is uncomfortable. Because talking would require admitting that we're watching a disaster in slow motion and choosing not to act. That the same mistakes of the Aral are being repeated before our eyes, with more data, more warnings, and fewer excuses. We saw a sea that sustains 15 million people shrinking 20 times faster than the oceans are rising. We saw prehistoric seals losing the ice where their pups are born. 200-million-year-old sturgeon being fished to extinction. Ports worth billions of dollars becoming ruins before they're finished. And on the horizon, rusted ships in the desert, the same fate that sealed the Aral, patiently waiting for the Caspian. Progress isn't a straight line upward. Sometimes it's a downward spiral disguised as normalcy. Each generation inherits the mistakes of the previous one and adds its own. The Aral was sacrificed for cotton. The Caspian is being sacrificed for oil, wheat, and indifference. Perhaps 50 years from now, tourists will walk across the dry bottom of the northern Caspian, photographing the hulls of rusted oil tankers. Guides will tell the story of how the largest lake in the world disappeared while the world was looking elsewhere. And someone will ask, as we asked today about the Aral, how did they let this happen? The answer will be the same as always. We knew, we measured, we documented. And we chose to do nothing. Thank you for being with us. Don't forget to look at the world more broadly. Until next time,